Hey there, this is Dan. You're watching the Salty Sea. We have a lot of Warcry tournament news to get into. So, if you don't know, Warhammer World is going to be having a pretty big tournament on the 27th of November. Save that date. 60 players. It is already sold out, which is really exciting. That'll be the biggest tournament ever. And I thought it was worth going through some recent tournaments and talking about, what I would play in that tournament if I was going, so that, if you're in the UK and you've got a ticket, or if any tickets open up, that you can make your decisions that way. So first, I'm just going to do a small roundup of a lot of small tournament news. First is a 16-player tournament in Denmark, won by Stormcast with a Bloodrack Medusa as the ally. Second place was Nurgle Mortals. Third place was Lumineth with Dawn Riders. I wish we knew the exact lists. Sadly, we don't. I especially wish it with this Nurgle Mortals list. I don't know. They did get a lot of buffs in the second edition, but who knows what was included here. We don't know what Chamber of Stormcast this is, unfortunately, but we do know, the Bloodrack combo that was very good in first edition is still good, even with a 20-point nerf. When I offhandedly mentioned that elves were dead in second edition, other than just a couple things, a lot of people reminded me of Wardens, and I think that's very true. This list had all Dawn Riders and Wardens. I think I could reverse engineer the list based on that or something pretty close, but still don't know exactly, so I'm just going to leave it here as is. We also had an 18-player tournament in Utah. I've got to thank the Dayton Warcry Club, Warren, for telling me about this tournament and the next one in Spain. If you're not checking that podcast out, you really should. They have it usually either every other week or always at least once a month, and they're all really plugged in to the scene. So this was 18 players. The first place list was an Ale Guzzler Gargant Cruel Boys list. The second place list was a Gorgon Beast of Chaos list. So monsters went 1 and 2. Monsters were not a requirement at the tournament. Like, not every list had a monster, for example. So it is interesting that monsters went 1 and 2. Now, they're not undefeated, but I'd be very curious what the record is for monster versus non-monster lists. Spain has been having tournaments. Spain has a huge kill team scene, so it makes sense that they've also got people interested in Warcry. I think Spain is just really into skirmish gaming in general, and that's really cool. If anybody wants to fly me out to Spain, I kind of speak a little bit of Spanish. I would love to check out their Warcry scene. So they had a tournament where the top 3 were all Soulblight Gravelords. When 2.0 came out, I talked about Graveguards as being potentially the best unit in Warcry. I think maybe that's been overshadowed in some people's mind by the Chimera, but Graveguard are still insane. 3 different Graveguard lists doing really, really well here. This double Vargoyle, 6 Graveguard, and 2 Skeletons list I think is a really tight, really clean list that I think is going to be really effective for anybody who tries it. So a lot to fear with the Graveguard there. Then we've also got a small tournament in Wrocław, Poland. This had harder lists than your average tournament. I think that scene was kind of famous for being really into running tournaments in 1.0. The winner was a Chimera Slaves to Darkness warband with Marauders and a Varengard with the Spear. The pack was Hidden Vault, Cursed Relic, and Reaper. That's just worth noting because, 1, most of these tournaments don't tell us, and 2, that pack somewhat favors low model count warbands. Any pack without ley lines in it is going to be, pretty punishing to high model count warbands. But it's also worth talking about because I had this exchange online. I just asked the question, do you know if the Chimera ever died? It wasn't even close. Apparently, the person who was piloting this list started feeling bad by the end of the tournament and tried to be a little bit more friendly and didn't play as hard as they could in the final round, and that's why they got a minor win. I think that's really funny, but yeah, I mean, this was only 3 rounds, right? 3-round tournaments are not quite as they don't tell you quite as much as a 4-round tournament would, but it's still really interesting. I wanted to go through some of the 2-in-1 lists just because that crew, that metagame, they're pretty dialed in as far as what's good, and they've got a lot of good list tech here. So first was, there were a few Soulblight Gravelords lists that went 2-in-1. They released their lists before the tournament. I expected that the Chimera list would... I predicted that the Chimera list would come second. It ended up winning. The list that I predicted would win ended up actually getting second on points and going 2-1. So it was this Vargoyle, 7 Graveguard, a Dread Warden to resurrect the Vargoyle if needed, or the Cryptghast if needed, and then another Graveguard. The Cryptghast giving a movement buff, the Vargoyle flying around when you need a dragon, and then the Dread Warden just giving really good utility. I think that this is just such a clean, such a perfect Soulblight Gravelords list. I love this list. I think it's really perfect, and it did well, and I assume that the one loss was to the Chimera, but I don't actually know. They also had a more elite Soulblight Gravelords list go 2-1, so that's worth taking a look at, especially if you like the Varg's gear. I'm a little bit dubious on it myself. They also had a few Destruction Soup lists go 2-1. So one was basically Troggoth Tribal, right? There were 3 Troggoths in the list, along with then the 2 Boggle-Eyes and the Brugit, which we've come to expect. They went with a Boingrot Bounder boss. The Polish crew is really bullish on Boingrot Bounder bosses and Troggoths in general. One of them I think is a really cool innovation. I love the Boingrot Bounder boss. I'm a little bit skeptical on Troggoths being the best thing you can be doing in Destruction Soup, but they are certainly very good and very solid. So there was another one with a Mega Boss in it and 2 Troggoths that did pretty well. I think both of these Destruction Soup lists are 7 models. It's really easy to make ones that go to 6, but I do think it's interesting that players who prepping for tournaments are eventually deciding to take 7 model warbands. There was also a Ironjawz list that went 2-1. This is the only one that was in the 2-1 bracket that I would say was sort of unexpected, or that people wouldn't have picked as one of the most frightening lists in the tournament to begin with. You know, I said at the beginning of the edition that the puzzle for Ironjawz was going to be difficult to figure out, but that all the pieces were there for a really competitive list. And I think that's true, and I think this goes a little bit of a ways towards solving it. You know, you want to have a Gorgrunta, you want to have at least 1 Brute in there. I like the addition of the Ardboy boss here. I think that's a really good and currently underappreciated model. So there's a lot to be interested in with this list. Try it out if you've got the pieces. It's tough to say if this is sort of here to stay, or if this is kind of, you know, there's always got to be one unproven list to kind of get into these brackets. So now that we've kind of done the roundup, again, thank you so much to the Dayton Warcry Club. You guys are the best. You can see the link down below. 60 players, again, for this Warhammer World event. It's sold out, which is incredibly exciting. I'm hoping that they'll expand it, but who knows. This is going to be the biggest Warcry tournament of all time. It's also going to be big enough for us to start data mining. So if it's on BCP. So one thing that's really changed with 2.0 is that you are seeing tournaments running on BCP now that you didn't in 1.0. If this goes on there as well, it's probably going to be worth it for me to go get a membership, unfortunately. But for the purposes of data mining, so that we can answer questions like, when a monster list goes up against a non-monster list, what's the percentage win rate of each? Or when a list with at least 4 Graveguard or more goes up against any other list, you know, what does that look like? We can kind of start tracking that once we do that, and this will provide enough competitive games to really get into it. Because if we're just going by lots of 16 player tournaments, and it's awesome that there's tons of like 10 to 18 player tournaments firing almost every weekend these days, somewhere around the world. Really awesome to see that, but once we have at least one 60 player in there too, that's when the data starts actually getting pretty reliable. You know, you need a lot of 16 player tournaments to start saying definitive things about data, but once we get this big one, we'll be able to do that. And so I'm really excited to do kind of a more analytics focused roundup sometime in December. But let's look forward to that tournament and what you can run in that tournament for success and what you can expect to see. Hopefully we will be able to at least provide some coverage of the tournament, even if we won't be able to be live on any of it or do any battle reports. First question is, does the meta matter? You know, there's sort of 2 things going on in Warcry, or really with any kind of game like this, where there's the winning meta versus the playing meta, like what you're likely to see. So there's the lists that sometimes not that many people will be taking, but that you have to be able to beat to win the tournament. And those are kind of the perceived, whether they are or aren't, best lists in the meta. So things like Destruction Soup, Soulblight Gravelords, monster lists. Really, those are the three big ones right now that it seems like people widely think are the three best things you can be doing. Whether those are or aren't the three best things in the game, remains to be seen. People can sort of test and innovate at their will. But the question being, how often will you actually play those things versus other things? Because most people show up to Warcry tournaments just looking to, have a good time and play their favorite faction. So one series of videos that I think is really worth checking out is from Off Meta Musings, the YouTube channel that you'll see the link down below again. They've got 2 tournament reports of having gone to Warhammer World Warcry tournaments. They actually won one of the 2 tournaments with a really cool Rotmeyer Creed warband. Rotmeyer Creed is really good. People complain about bespoke factions not being good enough. I think Iron Golems and Rotmeyer Krieg absolutely are. The only catch with Rotmeyer being you want to get an additional bloated one in there, because the bloated one is the best piece in the warband, and you only get 2 per box, or is it 1 per box? Either way, you want 2 or 3 bloated ones, and I think you only get 1 per box. Convert up more bloated ones, or what you do, or you get another set. Really good. You should definitely check out Off Meta's tournament reports. What I'm interested right now in talking about, though, is the list of opponents that he talked about, because he ran into Ogre Maw tribes, Chaos Legionnaires with the Centaurian. That's a really popular list combo right now. I saw it in the Nova narrative tournaments as well. People were running that. Splintered Fang, Stormcast Eternal's Thunderstrike, which was Praetors plus Vanquishers in this case, Soulblight Gravelords, and Stormcast Vanguard. And the double Stormcast matchup really hits with my experience, where there's just a lot of Stormcast Eternals out there in all of these tournaments. There's also a lot of bespokes, seemingly, specifically at the Warhammer World tournaments. It seems like the Warhammer World meta includes a lot of bespoke warbands, and so that's something that you want to be ready for. For example, having lots of Strength 3 fighters is actually pretty brutal on Stormcast Eternals. Strength 3 really kills them. Things like I sometimes run Sneaky Snufflers in my destruction lists, and Sneaky Snufflers actually have Strength 2. So point for point, they actually kind of rip Stormcast up, because you just get so many, you can have so many Snufflers and so many attacks into those Stormcasts with that 4 crit, something like that. But Strength 3 does not really do well against bespokes in terms of the points you're paying for the damage you do. Strength 5 and Strength 6 is pretty decent against both of them. So that can be something to think about, of just having at least one Strength 5 hammer or Strength 6 hammer in your list if you're worried about seeing a lot of Stormcast Eternals. So let's talk about lists that can do that or have those things. The first is, I'm calling this the NPE Wins Games edition. This is 2 lists that these are theory crafted lists that I've made for the Chimera. I think the Chimera is probably the strongest unit in the game right now. And I think there's 2 ways that you can pair a Chimera with a bunch of nets. The first one being the Unmade. So you have a Blissful one, 2 Awakened ones with Flail, 2 Ascended ones, and then a Chimera. Every single fighter in Unmade has a net, which is really powerful. That's really effective. Basically, the Awakened ones are the ones that you'll be wanting to use as netters. The Ascended ones are sort of glass cannon-y. But the idea here is that the glass cannon nature of the Blissful one and the 2 Ascended ones here doesn't hurt you as much when you have the gravity of the Chimera taking up the board and taking up your opponent's attention and potentially hunting down the fighters that would be able to really blow up your Blissful one. And then the one real challenge for monster lists that can be difficult for them is treasure missions, and there's 2 in the current pack. So that can be tough for monsters, which is why the Blissful one being able to move 8 is really nice there. It doesn't have a ton of wounds, so something like Cursed Relic can be tough if it's the first thing that picks up a treasure, but the fact that it moves really fast, it can do its kind of pinball thing, is really, really solid, and it's really good for hunting down opposing treasure carriers, taking your treasure, and then running away with it, right? 8 -3 because of the treasure, you're still getting 5-inch move, which is quicker than a lot of what's going on in the meta right now, because a lot of people are playing a lot of move 3. You also have the Spire Tyrants version, which you'd start with a Pit Champion, then the Chimera, then 3 Pit Fighters with nets, a Bestigor Destroyer, and a Frenzied Rager. The Spire Tyrants, point for point at fighting, are much, much better than the unmade folks. So I think that's the biggest reason to like Spire Tyrants. And then also, you know, do you want to convert up nets or not? Are you brave enough to kind of take chicken wire, attach it to the hands of the pit fighters that don't have nets, and then paint that up like it looks like a net, something like that? But I think there's a lot to like with both of these lists as far as their capability of just having the scariest hammer in the game and then surrounding it with things that really disrupt your opponent. There's other ways to support a Chimera, though, and also I'm just really into Nurgle monsters at the moment in different ways. So this first one, this is a list that I've actually tried out, and it definitely works really well. A Sloppity Bilepiper, a Bringer of the Word, 7 Plague Bearers, and a Chimera. The thing that I like about having 7 Plague Bearers with your Chimera is, so these lists, the thing that's really scary about the support around the Chimera is that there's a lot of nets to kind of hamper your opponent. For here, it's the fact that there's so many numbers that your opponent can't really clear the Plague Bearers while worrying about the Chimera. There's only one traditional objective mission in the mission packs right now, and that's Ley Lines, which you score each round. But there are 2 essentially objective and area control missions that have where everything scores at the end. Now, those don't really support chaff heavy warbands the way most objective missions do, because it doesn't score until the 4th round, but then it does matter for numbers in the 4th round. So it's really whoever has the most fighters left at the end of the day. So chaff that can survive the whole game is really advantaged in those missions, but chaff that dies quickly just doesn't have the old 1.0 chaff advantage at all. So what I like about this Nurgle list is that for essentially 3 missions, you actually get the benefit of having huge numbers warbands in the way you used to get it in Warcry 1.0. And your opponent they have to worry about this Chimera. The Chimera is coming for their hammers. It's coming to try and kill their hammers. How are they going to be able to clear all these Plague Bearers for those 3 missions where numbers matters without, just getting killed by the Chimera? So it's just very difficult for your opponent to kind of complete their assignment and actually play the mission without dealing with, the kind of 2-headed monster of your warband of this massive block of Plague Bearers plus your Chimera. And then Sloppity Bilepiper and the Bringer of the Word are just support heroes. I also really like having 6 Plague Bearers plus either a Witherlord or a Trueblood. Trueblood doesn't fight nearly as well as a Witherlord does, but it does have a net, which is, again, really, really nice. And the Witherlord is just the best fighter you can get for 175 or so into this list. You would be replacing the Bringer of the Word with those. The Bringer, I've found, is okay, but not incredible. The threat of having lead from the back is nice with Plague Bearers. They're really scary with, say, +2 attacks, +3 attacks, but it's not as necessary because you're often going to be trying to use your triples with your Chimera to drag and maul things. I also really like doing Rotmire Creed with a Cygor. Or a Gorgon. You can have a Witherlord, 2 Bloated Ones, 2 Mirefolk Outcasts, a Cygor, and a Fury. If you want greater killing power, you can also change the Fury to a 3rd Outcast and run a Gorgon. I actually starting to like those more after I created these slides, but before I'm recording now, I actually got to play a mission. I'm preparing for a video about monster tactics, both playing with monsters, playing against monsters, and then analyzing what it looks like when 2 monsters fight each other. And one thing I've noticed is not every monster can keep the Chimera honest, but the Gorgon is one that really can. The sequencing of monster v monster fights are really important, and so if you have a really good Gorgon list, you can actually out sequence a Chimera because you're so much cheaper, and a Gorgon that gets sequencing advantage on a Chimera can actually win the fight, whereas most monsters, even if they have sequencing advantage, will still lose to the Chimera. Either way, I kind of like this this setup here. The Cygor, of course, is so amazing at just like throwing boulders across the battlefield, really covering for the weaknesses of Rotmire, even though Rotmire is a competitive warband. I mean, we saw Alpha Meta Musings winning a tournament with it. But the Cygor just being a really nice addition to them. And then, of course, you know, you can go with the Gorgon if what you want is just pure damage. I also want to talk about Stormcast, partly because clearly they're a big part of the meta. Even if they're not a huge part of the winning meta, we did see, you know, first place in Denmark, second place in Oslo. We're seeing a lot of Stormcast in these Warhammer World tournaments. But there's a really big difference between untuned and tuned lists. To take Thunderstrike, right? Vindictors and Annihilators are really good. But Praetors and, let's say, Vanquishers are not very good. And so, you know, it's easy to trip, fall, and end up with a really solid Stormcast list. It's also really easy to trip, fall, and end up with a terrible Stormcast list. So I do think that the top Stormcast lists are worthy of a ton of respect, and I've put two here that are pretty tight. Using this first one is Warrior Chamber. This is using some of the sort of proven tech from the list that took second place in Oslo, Norway. Basically having a Tree Revenant Scion to provide your mobility for you by teleporting around the board. And then, of course, your Old Guard. This list has 2 Paladins with Star Soul Maces. Those are just an absolutely terrifying piece. You can see them here in this art piece hanging out behind their Lord Relictor. Just the point-for-point damage on Paladins is insane. They've also got the Decimator Prime, puts out a ton of damage, and with the extra range. Protectors are really nice. They're move 3, so they're slow, but they're incredibly points efficient, and they have range 3, which really I think makes up for move 3 quite a bit. And of course, all of Warrior Chamber has that bonus move, which again makes up for the slowness, even though you have to have an ally who's been damaged to get use of the bonus move. It's still really good. I also really like Protectors having move 3, gets them able to attack monsters while being out of range of those monsters, forcing the monster to use Dragon Maul to even get an attack in. So you can kind of put monsters in an awkward spot there. Thunderstrike also has really solid options. The Knight Arcanum is the best mage in the game, I think. It can spit out a lot of range damage with that ability if the dice are high on it, and it's only a double, so often the dice are pretty high. Vindictors are good, Annihilators are good, and then of course you can put the Old Guard in the deployment group with the Annihilators to kind of boost their movement, since they don't have that plus, you know, that free bonus move that the Warrior Chamber has. This is the kind of thing where with Stormcast, the way you split them up, Hammer, Dagger, Shield, really matters, just in that you want to take a look at your tournament pack before the tournament, because that's going to matter. You're going to want to know what's going on for each individual one, and you're going to want to put your Old Guard with your most important slow pieces to kind of power them up the board. One thing I like about Old Guards in these lists, though, is after the first round, you don't really need to keep the Old Guard around to sort of empower you to run away sometimes, the way you do when Old Guard is pumping up, say, slow chaff like Arcanauts. And so you can put your Old Guard into combat, which is nice because it's got the toughness 5, it's got, you know, not incredible damage output, but somewhat respectable. Like, if you're actually fighting with your Old Guard, it's not just 110 points of dead weight that you took for the movement buff. It can actually do a job. And in these lists, it's really only looking to use the ability probably in the first round. So after that, you can actually put it into combat with these lists, which they really need. Whereas, you know, in my Nova Open list, I was really looking to keep it alive in most missions because I was going to want the movement later. I also wanted to take sort of a quick take on some of the classic warbands ideas that I'm not associated that much with. I haven't been playing much, but that, you know, are out there, and I want to put in some sort of theory crafting for those if you're not sure what you want to do. So for Soulblight Swarm, this is just Soulblight Gravelords being one of the scariest warbands out there because Graveguard are so good. If you don't want to run a monster, just netlist. I've shown 2 lists on screen here that I think are really good. The Rocklaw Swarm list with the Nighthaunt ally I think is incredible looking. The double Vargoyle list that won in Spain, I think looks great if you want a more, quote unquote pure list. However, what I would run is this list with the Terrorgeist. You start with a Terrorgeist, a Necromancer. I know I've said sometimes that Necromancers are traps, but here I'm just using it because it's really cheap, and that quad is going to be relevant with how many numbers we've got. Then I'd have a Cryptghast for the speed buff, and then 3 Graveguard with Great Blade, 3 Skeletons, and then 1 Graveguard with the Blade and Shield. So you're putting out 7 chaff models, 10 models total, so this isn't like full swarm, but it's really respectable numbers, and you have a Terrorgeist. And Dragon Maul is just so good to have at your disposal. So yeah, this is what I would take. I would be really confident with this, and even just 3 big blade Graveguards are still going to, they're going to get their fighting in. They're going to get their damage in. They're going to be really scary, and the Cryptghast is going to be able to put them where you need them. And if you pop that Necromancer quad, you're going to ruin someone's day. I also want to talk about Destruction Soup. I think there's a lot of people confused about what it means, and given that it's one of the 3 pillars of the meta right now, I think it's worth talking about it. So this is kind of a catch-all term for anything that kind of follows a certain template, but you have a ton of options to personalize your Destruction Soup lists. So the requirements are Gloomspite Gits has to be your faction. You need to have 2 to 3 things with nets. The things that have nets there are Netters and Boggle Eyes, which is a member of the Gobapalooza. Then you're going to want 1 Brugit, just to have that big damage buff available to you. And then just bring your favorite hero. You can really bring any Gloomspite hero as long as you have a reason why you like it. Then you bring 2 or 3 badasses from this list. This list over on the right of the screen here, I think, is the only ones I would really consider. I know I've seen people bring Fellwater Troggoths. I don't think they're as powerful as the other things on this list. The only reason why I would ever bring a Fellwater is just if you couldn't fit a Rock Gut and you needed to make the points work. Of the 2 to 3 things you bring from this list, 1 needs to be fast, and at least 1 needs to be like crazy points efficient in combat. And it doesn't have to be one of the things from here needs to be fast. You can also, Gloomspite Gits has some reasonable fast models too. You just need 1 fast hammer in your list. So some of my takes on it. The first would be having a monster plus U-Messin available to me. So I would start with a Loon Boss on Giant Cave Squid, a Boggle Eye, a Brugit, a Netta, an Ale Guzzler Gargant, and a Brute Boss with Smasha and Claw. After I wrote this list, I don't have all these pieces, but I tried kind of a somewhat similar list, having the Ale Guzzler and the Brute Boss with Smasha and Claw recently. It was pretty effective. I was happy with it. I used a Bounder Boss instead of a Loon Boss as well, and I played 2 Sneaky Snufflers, which I think are an underrated piece in Gloomspite Gits. It was pretty effective, so that's a worthwhile list to consider. I'll pop that one on the screen right now. Hopefully I remember, crossing my fingers. But I do think that this version here with the Loon Bosses are much harder to kill than the other options in Gloomspite Gits, so that can be really nice. And then Boggle Eye and the Brugit give obviously a ton of utility there, and they're much harder to kill than regular Nettas are. So I think they're really solid inclusions to have, and it's worth going down to 6 models to get that kind of durability there and also have the monster, because the 3 activations on the monster makes it a little bit more forgiving for the fact that you have 6 models. Here, it's not so much, most monster lists I talk about how you want to support them with numbers, you want to support them with nets. Here it's more a monster list, a monster supporting an already powerful setup. And of course, I love having U-Messin because Destruction Soup kind of famously low on models, so it can be a little bit vulnerable in objective missions, and that's where this Brute Boss really comes in to use U-Messin on people. If I were going to go with 7 fighters, and I'm also worried about seeing a lot of Stormcast Eternals, because Stormcast, they've got their tons of armor, they've got the ability to clear off your netters, and also they have a lot of things where if you net one thing, they have other stuff that can get a lot of kills, right? Netters are useful for them, but they're not like some of those lists where they really only have 2 hammers. It's like every Stormcast has killing power. And so that can make them pretty resistant to nets. So I really like this list with a Mega Boss and a Gutlord. Both of these have strength 6. You also get 7 fighters here, so you get more activations. And, you know, the Gutlord and the Mega Boss are just incredibly good at beating Stormcast in fights, just because that strength 6 is just such a rock, paper, scissors on the Stormcast, especially if it's a toughness 5 Stormcast, like a Dracoline, something like that. But even like the Vindictors at toughness 6, those are basically like brick walls to most warbands, and the Gutlord and the Mega Boss are actually capable of clearing them, hitting on 4-ups. So this is a sort of destruction soup list that I think would work really, really well in your average metagame, your average kind of very Stormcast heavy metagame. So if you're going into a big tournament with unknown people, you don't know what people are bringing, you probably should expect a lot of Stormcast, and this would be a great list to take into that kind of meta. And Gutlords are sweet, you know. Things I didn't mention here, Tragus, Ardboy bosses, the 135 point guy, Sneaky Snufflers, those are all really good tools for getting up to 7 activations if you want. I know a lot of people value getting up to 7 instead of 6 in these destruction soup lists. Both of my lists here combine your Gloomspite Git's boss requirement with your speed requirement to kind of hit more birds with fewer stones. That's not necessary. You can also go with a Moon Clan boss, which is just a cheap leader. You can bring in Madcap Shaman or the Fungoid Cave Shaman if you want those abilities, plus the kind of little bit of ranged damage that they give you. Those just box you into taking one of the, you know, one of the fast allies from this list right here. So finally, I want to talk about a couple lists that I really like that are kind of off meta right now, or nobody's really playing these things, and I think they should, because I think these two concepts are really powerful, and a lot of people could get some real great mileage out of them. So the first one is Ossiarch Bone Reaper's Counter Control. I'd start with a Mortek Hekatos. The Ossiarch Bone Leaders are generally not very good. The only ones I would really ever consider are the Hekatos, the Soul Mason, and maybe the Leash Cavalos. But in general, those are the weakest part of the warband, so I've chosen to just go with the cheapest one. Then I've got a Morghast Harbinger with the Halberd, a Stalker with 4 swords. Those are really your hammers. The Morghast is great because it flies 8 inches. The Stalker is great because move 5, but it also has a free move on a double. Right now I am valuing those so highly. I have found that all of the free move doubles have just been so incredible in all of my games. I've been getting a ton of leverage out of Slangor Fiend Bloods lately, which are in Chaos. Now, Slaanesh isn't quite up to the top of the meta, but it's like a really solid high B tier force because of how good Fiend Bloods are. This Stalker kind of takes the same concept. Then you have 8 Mortek Guard, 5 with the Sword and Shield, 3 with the Great Blade. And what's amazing here is that the Sword and Shield ones have toughness 5. The Great Blades are toughness 4 and do very respectable damage for a cheap price, 50 points. They, yes, only move 3, but the Mortek Hekatos can give a bunch of them a movement buff, which is really nice. And then it actually fights okay. It's just bad because it has movement 3. What you're really looking to do is get into position. Then you start each round by picking things off with your hammers that haven't activated yet. Your Morghast Harbinger and your Stalker with 4 swords, trying to give yourself activation advantage. And then if your opponent tries to do the same thing to you, pick off your cheap things to kind of whittle your numbers down, that's when you start reacting on them. This is a reaction control list because counter is really good, and the Ossiarch Bone Reaper's reaction that can deal 5 damage back if they don't crit you is also really good on fighters that don't have a ton of dice. So if your opponent is attacking with a fighter that has a lot of dice, you counter because toughness 5 means they're going to have a lot of misses. So you're just going to blow them off the board with their own attacks. And then if they're a low dice fighter. You know, a lot of the strength 6 fighters that are walking around, they don't have a lot of dice. They're less than 50% likely to have a crit in their roll. And if they're rolling with that, like if they have a mega boss that clears toughness 5 pretty effectively, well, tough for them. They are going to take 5 damage coming back, right? Because you're going to be able to use the Ossiarch Bone Reapers, what would you call it, their faction reaction. And that's really good. So you should check out, if you don't know about Swolehammer, I'll put the link down below. This is 3 channels now that I want you to check out for Warcry, but they had a really nice little tier list for reactions. I don't agree with where everything is ranked, but I think it's really cool, and that's the whole point, is to kind of create debate for, you know, where these things should be ranked. But they ranked the Ossiarch reaction as the #1 reaction in the game. I would give it to Gloomspite Gitz, but the Ossiarch one is up there. I mean, I would definitely put it in the top 3 or 4, right? So it really lets you kind of build a list just like this that kind of is all about reacting, and I just love that. The second one that I would try that's kind of off meta at the moment, though we did see something somewhat similar, well, actually not similar at all. We've seen Lumineth take 3rd in a tournament, but otherwise, you know, most of Lumineth is actually really bad right now. Their archers are really bad right now. Their blade lords are really bad right now. But you can put a Cenari Caligrave, a Guard Master from Tempest Eye, 3 Alarith Stone Guard, 3 Wardens, and an Achelian King as your list. The Caligrave has a really cheap, it's on a double. It's an AoE debuff for your opponent. It gives them -1 to crit damage. That doesn't seem like a lot. However, there are some warbands are running on 1-3 damage profiles or 1-4 damage profiles where regular hits don't do much damage, so they're really just fishing for crits anyway to get their damage in. And especially the 1-3 profiles, the Cenari Caligrave, when you put a 1-3 profile down to 1-2, they're not doing anything to you, right? So this is a pretty low risk investment. You're only investing 120 points into it, but it can be game winning in some matchups and very small output in others. But the other thing I like about that debuff is Stone Guard have 12 wounds. There's a lot of actually like 4-8 fighters going around there in the big hammers. Like the mega boss is 4-8, so a lot of them are either 3 hits or a crit and a hit, and that's what kills your Stone Guard. But they only roll 3 dice, right? So a Caligrave going -1 crit can actually put them in a situation where they leave you at 1 health really often, and 1 health is all you need, right? Then you get to attack back. So I do think that the Caligrave can be really valuable against certain opponents based on, you know, what their damage math looks like and how it lines up against your Stone Guard. Now the Stone Guard themselves are just incredibly damage efficient, and then the Wardens are great because they have that range 3, 5-inch movement, so they just have this incredible amount of ability to cover the board. Their damage isn't mind-blowing, but it's somewhat it's at least enough to pay attention to. And then the Achelian King, just a really fast hammer, flies around the board. If you get a Rampage, it's a really good Dragon Slayer, Monster Hunter, essentially. It can also, for I think a triple, it can really boost its own damage really high up so that you have a really solid chance of double bracketing a monster. And a lot of monsters, their damage really falls down once you've double bracketed it. So a lot of the time, if the monster moves, you know, to kind of scare your Achelian King, and then you get 2 attacks in, with one of the attacks getting the Achelian King buff, all of a sudden you've bracketed the monster down to the point where the Achelian King is going to survive the round, and then you can actually potentially do it again depending on who has initiative, to the point where you could potentially win one-on-one with an Achelian King against a monster. And there's just not a lot of non-monster fighters in the game that have the potential to beat a monster one-on-one, and so that's why I really, really value the Achelian King. I've seen a lot of people moving away from this paradigm of list building, but I still really think that Chaff plus Dragons just has real benefits. Now, that doesn't mean I don't believe in things like Destruction Soup. I've played them. I like them. I think they're really good. I also, think some of the full swarm warbands, like what Nurgle Mortals can, or Nurgle Demons can do, or like what Kharadron Overlords can do, or like what Soulblight Gravelords can do. I think those are all really effective. I didn't mention KO Arcanauts at all in this sort of video, but KO Arcanauts are still one of the best units in the game, and it seems like no one's playing them. Obviously, I played them at Nova. They were really good. I told people to net list my list, and nobody did, which is fine. But I do just think that people should be aware that KO Arcanauts are really, really good. I think all of that is solid, but I just think that, Chaff plus Dragons is still solid. You just need a plan for keeping your Chaff alive until round 4. And for me, the plan basically goes around making sure that your dragons take up so much gravity on the board that that your opponent is terrified. Now, maybe that goes towards having a monster. For example, this Soulblight Gravelords list that I recommended here could not be a more Dan list, right? You've got a really scary dragon and then a lot of chaff, right? But so that you're not full swarm, but you've got the dragon. That is kind of my style of list building to a T, but I just think that if you're kind of a skilled player with how you use your dragons, you can give them so much gravity on the board that your opponent doesn't have the freedom to pick off your chaff the way they'd like. And in this edition, you need to have survivable chaff, things like Plague Bearers, things like Skeletons and Graveguard, things like Mortec Guard, things like Wardens don't have a lot of health per point, but they have that range 3 so that you can play really carefully with them. Things like KO Arcanauts, right? You just need very durable chaff in this meta, but if you have that, then you can really have an advantage in any of the things where numbers only count in round 4, and then of course you'll dominate ley lines, and so then you just have to make sure that you have a real plan for these treasure missions, and that's where the dragons come in, because those are still really good in treasure missions. So I think that this paradigm still really works. Now, there's other things that are also working really well in the meta, so it's not the only thing the way it has been in other times, but actually, it's never been the only way to build a good warband, but it has been more dominant than it is now. But I think it's really very viable right now, and I think there's a number of factions that can do it really well, like Ossiarch Bone Reapers and Lumineth, which is why I wanted to highlight them. So I would personally play one of these two lists. I don't think they're as powerful as potentially maybe they're on the same level as this one. I don't think they're as powerful as the Soulblight Gravelords Terrorgeist list or the Chimera lists that I showed. I think those are probably the two most powerful things that I've kind of shown on this video, but I do think they're just one step below, right along with the top Stormcast lists, right along with the Destruction Soup lists that don't have monsters in them. I just think that these are really, really solid and that you can absolutely win a tournament with them. So that's what I'm into. This is what I would play as one of these two lists here if I was just going to have fun but also have a chance to win the tournament and to be playing something that isn't the number 1 thing. So yeah, that's my tournament news right there, my list building session, and I'll be back with a kind of monster tactics list. This will only be the second true tactics list that I put on the channel. I've mostly focused on strategy. This is certainly a more strategic list here. So I'm excited. It might take me a little while to put that one together. I want it to be really comprehensive. So you might see a couple weeks before my next video. So until then, may all your rolls be crits.